As you know, Canada is 90% rural by geography and has slightly less than 20% of the population, and roughly 10% of Canadians' doctors work in rural areas. Canada's rural population is poorer, it's less healthy, and it has significantly higher proportion of Indigenous peoples, particularly in the north. Rural Canadians have less access to health care and may have to travel very significant distances, particularly in the north, to get such care. Canada's rural physicians are older. They're much more likely to be international medical graduates. I'm an exception in that instance. The health care in very small rural communities may be provided by nurses and other health care workers rather than physicians. Access to specialists is limited, and most rural physicians work as generalists and include palliative care within their skill set. Finally, the question of who does what. I believe that whatever the personal beliefs of the physician may be, they must be willing to discuss all legal options with their patients and to make appropriate referrals if they themselves are unable to take part in that service. I think here the way abortion works in Canada is a reasonable, has some similarities. Physicians should not be obligated to be involved with a service that they have moral difficulties with. However, they should be able to have such a discussion with their patients and to refer when necessary. One of the questions that has arisen in the past, or in discussions about this, is death certificates, about how they're filled out. I think death certificates should have physician-assisted dying as the immediate cause of death, with the diagnosis that led to this as an underlying cause. And now the concerns in rural areas. The challenge in rural areas is often, as in the community I live, there is a group of physicians who work together, and how is it possible to arrange a second opinion about someone's suitability for this or their competence? I think it's inappropriate to do that within a group of physicians who work together. How is it possible to arrange an expedited psychiatric consultation if that's required? If all physicians in a group are conscientious objectors to this process, how do patients obtain a service which is considered legal in a small community where the physicians are not able morally to provide that service? This is a little different than the abortion discussion, in that these patients are much less likely to be able to travel safely. Where and how in a rural community, when everyone knows everyone, is it possible to carry out this process? What would the effect be on other members of the community? And what would the effect be on the staff of a rural hospital? What would the effect be if there was radically different viewpoints within a small group of physicians? And those are the important points.
Thank you for that. I'm not sure I have the answers for those as well. I think the role of telemedicine was mentioned, and I think if we're looking at a patient that has requested physician-assisted death and is in one of these communities where there's only one physician group, it would be most appropriate that this patient be assessed by a second physician. And if that can't be done in person, then it needs to be done in some other fashion, and that would be presumably via video or telephone link, preferably video. If you had a small community where there was no physician who was willing to participate in this process, other than informing a patient about, if the patient requested, informing them about what the process was, it creates a great challenge, because I really don't think that it's appropriate for these decisions to be solely made without actually sitting in the room with the patient.
How can nurse practitioners or other people in rural areas deal with this if there is a legitimate request, maybe assessed through telehealth, for physician-assisted death for someone who wants to stay in their home, be they living in Grise Fiord in the high Arctic or anywhere else in Canada, and a cocktail of drugs could be flown in the mail, like other drugs are flown in the mail. Do you ever, can you imagine that happening? And what kind of problems would there be?
Certainly, I can imagine, as any physician who's provided palliative care, I have prescribed lethal doses of drugs to patients all the time without the expectation that they take them. Just to clarify that for the committee, if I have a patient who has terminal cancer, for instance, they will go home perhaps with a dose of medication that if you or I had it, it would be terminal. And the striking thing to me is that I cannot recall in my personal experience any patient that has chosen to take that their medication in that fashion. I think the real challenge, if you're prescribing medications at a distance and you're sending them over through the mail, and they're being administered by the patient's family or a nurse, what happens when things go wrong? And I don't really want to make this comparison, but there's been cases where death by lethal injection in the States has gone badly wrong, and those are the cocktail, delivered by physicians. And I would hate to think of some nurse in Greece Ford who has that kind of experience.